us today. We know you're all busy and appreciate you spending this hour with us. Hopefully you'll find it well spent. My name is Jeremy Beard. I am the Solution Sales Manager for LENSEC. I have 17 years of experience in all aspects of enterprise security, ranging from front-end risk mitigation to physical security design and engineering. Enough about me. I do want to introduce the company LENSEC for those who don't know. LENSEC has been providing enterprise-level integrated security management solutions since 1998, and we're best known for our video management software, Perspective VMS. And whether through our partners in the U.S. or abroad, or our in-house system design engineers, we custom design scalable IP video surveillance systems. Those range from 5 cameras to installations over 7,000 cameras, and of course, integrating other edge devices such as access control and the like. So thanks for joining us in our professional webinar series. We do host these monthly with varying topics to bring our clients and industry subject matter expertise. So please let me know, if any of you, if you have any topics you would like to see covered in the future. We will absolutely consider those and try to bring them to you. Through this platform, we do seek to educate and empower our clients in order to assist improving your overall security posture. So, with quick logistical notes before I hand it over, as you see the panel to your right, this is where you can offer up questions. We will answer them at the end of the presentation. If we run out of time, we will respond to all questions in full through email or by phone in the coming days. Lastly, we have a brief survey at the end. If you'd like a certificate of completion or the presentation itself, you can request this in the survey. We would really appreciate it if you would take a few minutes to fill it out. So without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce Gary Sigrist. Gary is a nationally recognized consultant whose firm, Safeguard Risk Solutions, offer liability reduction, making facilities, assets, and people safer and more secure. Mr. Gary L. Sigrist, take it away, sir.
All right. I'm going to figure out how to work my screen real quick. My name is Gary Sigrist. I am the CEO and President of Safeguard Risk Solutions. And I really want to start by thanking the attendees for being here. As a retired safety director for a large school district, I know how valuable your time is. I also would like to thank LENSEC for making this webinar available. One of the things that I know schools struggle with is not only getting the information, but also being able to afford the information. These webinars are free, as are the archives of previous webinars. So if you've never attended one of the LENSEC webinars, we will let you know how you can access the archives of previous webinars that we've done. Our goal here is to provide you with information that you can use in your schools to help keep your students and staff safe. So today we're going to talk about threat assessments. Now, threat assessments are a way of preventing an event from occurring. If we know that in the majority of targeted acts of violence and active shooter events in a school are perpetrated by members of the school, what we would like to be able to do is put in place a process that will allow you to stop the event from occurring. There's a lot of things that we can do once an event has occurred, but at that point there's going to be injuries, possibly death, and when we look back, we're going to say, wow, if we only would have done a couple of things, we probably could have prevented this from happening in the first place. So those of my educators out here, I was an 8th grade science teacher before I was promoted to the safety director of the school district I work. And so I'm going back to my teaching days. I'm going to do a little bit of this is our pre-test. So, when we're going through this, because rumor has it there'll be a quiz afterwards, and these questions might be on the quiz, but, are these active shooter events, are they well planned or are they spontaneous? Do people just snap? Question number 2, when we talk about the use of mental health assessment when we have a student on a pathway to violence, what are we really trying to do with that mental health assessment? And then question number 3, we're going to look at different types of threats. because the type of threat will dictate your response. So we want to be able to say to a parent, we took this action because we believed it was this type of threat. So when we look at this, I want you to understand this is not training. You could not, if you chose to at this moment, to say, okay, we're going to listen to everything Gary has to say and we're going to implement this tomorrow, you're not ready. This isn't training, because if your district or if your school decides that you're going to have a threat assessment team, there's got to be policy. Your staff has to be trained. You have to have the proper paperwork so that you can document things that you're doing. And the other one you're going to want to do is bring in your first responders, your fire and your police, because in some cases, as we'll see today, an incident may occur that we're going to have to notify law enforcement because there's a threat of a crime occurring. So this what we're talking about today. It's based on research. The final report and findings of the Safe School Initiative. This came out. This is the second document that came out after the Columbine attacks. The Secret Service Safe School Initiative came out almost 2 years after the Columbine attacks, and then this came out afterwards. And we put the link here, which of course you can't use right now, but we'll send you this information so that you can access this information. So this is research-based, which is important in education before we do anything to make changes in our schools. Now, Marissa Reddy, I put her name there. Her name is now Marissa Randazzo. Marissa Reddy is one of the people who is the author of the Secret Service Safe School Initiative. I've had the pleasure of taking additional classes with her, and in my opinion, she's probably one of the tops in her field when it comes to school threat assessment. So we look at some facts about schools. People don't just snap. These are not impulsive or random events. There were clues, there was leakage, people knew that this was going to happen, no one connected the dots. And what happens is, because we're not connecting the dots, we're not finding these students when they're preparing and planning for their violent attack. And as we saw in the Safe School Initiative and in the follow-up, there's a thing called leakage where students told other students their plans, and those students didn't share that information with anyone. So after Columbine, I can remember people would come up to me and say, Gary, we've got to prevent these kind of attacks. How will we know who the next shooter will be? And some people obviously erroneously said, oh, that's going to be easy. Those are going to be the students that are wearing all black because at Columbine they wore all black. And that's just false. Okay, you can't look at somebody and say this person is on the pathway to violence because there is no unique profile. We can't look at somebody and say, yes, this person is going to commit this event. And we can't do this with students. We can't do this with adults, because one of the things we should be thinking about is not only could a student be a perpetrator of violence towards a school, but it could also be an adult that's in there. So most people are suicidal, and this is frightening for a couple of reasons. Students, it's not unusual, it's not acceptable, but it's not unusual for a student to ideate about suicide, especially in the teen years. And we could get into the whole, why students think that might be acceptable, but the bottom line is they don't understand that suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary problem. But if we have a student that's talking about committing suicide, and we know that some of these events end in suicide, that's a warning sign that we should heed. And so in your schools and in your workplace, I always say that there needs to be a mechanism that if I hear somebody talking, or I overhear someone talking about suicide, or a friend of mine says that they're thinking of committing suicide, I need to know who I can contact to get help. So as we look at the phases of an active shooter event, I'm just going to pop them all up. The first, of course, is our conceptualization or fantasy. And when we look at these, I was an 8th grade science teacher and I was a police officer at the exact same time. And so it would not be unusual for a student to walk out of my room and say, you know, hey, I want to kill Mr. Sigrist. And if another teacher heard that, you know, obviously that would raise a red flag. But really, that's not a severe threat. And if you interviewed that child, you would say, you know, what's going on here? And he said, well, I just failed a test in his class. Well, do you really want to kill him? No, I'm mad. Okay, well, that's not acceptable language, but what we've just done is we've done a threat assessment. Is this person on a pathway to violence? Because kids say dumb things all the time. And we as adults, and we as schools especially, sometimes make bad decisions because we don't evaluate the threat. This is why in the January after the Sandy Hook shootings, a 7-year-old who chewed a Pop-Tart to make it look like a gun was suspended for 2 days because he pointed the Pop-Tart at people and went bang, bang, bang. That was a fantasy. That was that child had no intent of harming anyone, yet they were suspended for 2 days. So the first phase, of course, is the conceptualization, thinking about it. As we move on, now let's pretend that a student says, you know, I'm going to kill Mr. Sigrist, and I know that he eats lunch every day in his room by himself at 11 o'clock, and my grandfather has rifles, and he keeps them locked up in the basement, but he keeps the keys in the tackle box in the garage. And now this child is starting to put plans together. They're starting to have more detail. You can tell it's more than just fantasy. And one of the things we're going to start to see at this stage is leakage. And what leakage is, this is when they tell somebody. This is when the parent walks into the room and finds bomb-making materials or sawed-off shotgun barrels, or they look at their web history and it says how to shoot somebody or how to build a bomb. All of these things show that a person is in the planning stage, and we can begin to see evidence through this leakage of what's going on, and we could start to try to stop the process. When they're in the preparation where now they're gaining weapons, et cetera, there's going to be some overt leakage. We're going to see things. We're going to hear things. I never want to make it sound like I'm criticizing teachers in past events, because in reality, we weren't doing a very good job of training teachers and administrators. But if you look at some of the writings that were turned in as assignments, some of the videos, some of the artwork, some of the poetry that was turned into teachers that the teachers later admitted was troubling, yet they didn't report that to anyone. And now with our schools, we do a much better job because they have threat assessment teams, and these threat assessment teams say, oh, okay, I read this journal entry. It kind of frightened me. I'm going to take it to the principal. The other types of overt leakage is in almost every school shooting, students have warned other students, don't come to school tomorrow, or don't worry, I'm not going to shoot you, or if you want to videotape this, be up on the balcony. And so we need to give those students who know about the plan or who have heard rumors about the plan a way to share that information with adults. If you have a cyberbully hotline, if you have any kind of anonymous hotline, if your community has a text-to-tip line, all of those can be used to report if there's a concern. Approach and implementation, now we're hoping that we get lucky, because maybe the person on their way to the school gets stopped by the police or they're in a crash. Something prevents them from carrying it out. In the implementation, they're at the door. Now it's too late. Now there's when the first shot is fired, when the suspect comes on the scene, at this point in time, there is no how do we prevent. Now we're going to have to react. So threat assessment, it's a practice that was brought on by the United States Secret Service. This is the same process that we use to protect the President of the United States and other dignitaries. So if it's good enough to protect our President, I think it's probably good enough to protect our schools. So we want to make sure that we use this process because we know that we can prevent attacks. Every week, bad things don't happen at school because people said something. The school had a threat assessment team, so the threat was evaluated. They had an anonymous tip line, so somebody presented the information. a parent knew who to contact at the school. The bottom line is we want to start putting as much information together as quickly as we can. We want to connect the dots so that we can prevent it. So we're not saying, is this a violent person? We're asking, is this person on the pathway to violence? Because different things can put people on the pathway to violence. And just as things put people on the pathway to violence, we can also remove people from that pathway to violence. But in order to do that, we're going to need to get information as quickly as possible, and we're going to have to intervene as quickly as possible. One of the issues that people have with threat assessments is it's not an adversarial process. We are not trying to punish someone who might be on a pathway to violence. What we're really trying to do is we're trying to get those people help. We want to take them off that pathway to violence. So if we look at the 4 current approaches, mental health, automated decision-making, profiling, and threat assessment, we'll take a look at those one at a time. And mental health risk assessment is used for evaluating somebody who we believe might be on a pathway to violence. Do they need additional help to remove them from that pathway? Is there something going on in their life that is causing them to be on that pathway? It doesn't mean that if you seek mental health assessment, you are on a pathway to violence. You know, we take a lot of young people, we take a lot of adults who have suffered a tragic loss in their family, and we send them to mental health to help them cope with their loss. That doesn't mean that that person's on a pathway to violence just because they sought help. However, if there are indicators that tell us that somebody is on the pathway to violence, we can use mental health assessment to help determine where that child is on that pathway to violence and things that we can do to take them off that pathway. If we look at an automated decision-making process, this was me when I was a teacher. You know, if a student came in tardy, there was a series of things we did when they were tardy. You know, it could have been a verbal warning the first time, a written warning the second time, and an after-school detention the third time. So it didn't really matter why they were tardy. We just made a random decision, and this is the process that we're going to go through every time they're tardy without looking at anything else in that process. Profiling, of course, is really popular because of what's on TV, and there's 2 kinds of profiling. There's a profiling where we're using to try to pick someone who might be on the pathway to violence, and then the way they use it on TV is they look at a crime, and based on the crime scene, they try to determine, okay, tell us about the person who committed the crime. Well, that doesn't work when we're trying to prevent a targeted act of violence. One of the problems with profiling is too many people fit the profile. So we end up with a larger match of people than what we really need in trying to determine if somebody is on that pathway. So someone could be identified as, hey, this person could be on a pathway to violence, but really they don't pose a threat. And sometimes the profile doesn't match the actual person. So that brings us to threat assessment. And in the threat assessment, it's pretty quantitative. We have a step-by-step process that allows us to determine whether or not somebody's on that pathway. And it begins with, why are you concerned about that student? If we go back to the beginning of this, and a student says, I want to kill Mr. Sigrist, okay, a student is threatening to kill somebody. That's a concern. It's really no different than a student who says, I'm going to blow up this building, or a student that says, I want to hurt myself. Something causes us to have a concern, and that's what starts the process. We gather the information. We do a background check, so to speak. You know, the student who said, I want to kill Mr. Sigrist, what's going on? I failed a test. I'm angry. Okay, now we know why the behavior is occurring, and we can come up with a way of dealing with that. And to be honest with you, the student who says, I'm going to kill Mr. Sigrist, a quick threat assessment says, I'm just mad. Okay, we're going to have a conversation with your parents, and that's it. Don't do this again. We're going to move on. We're going to manage the situation. So it starts with facts. We have to get a conclusion based on those facts. And then if we believe that somebody is on a pathway to violence, we truly believe that somebody wants to harm themselves or others, then we need to come up with strategies to prevent that from happening. So, as I said earlier, this is an evidence-based. This is not just some whim. This has been studied and proven to be effective. It's every week we are preventing targeted acts of violence on campuses, schools, and in the workplace. We can use it for identifying a large number of people. It's the only real cost to putting in a threat assessment team is to train your people. If you have a threat assessment team and they catch somebody before they commit the act, if the parents are not helpful, it protects you from liability because they say you're just picking on my child. If you have a threat assessment team and an event occurs that you could not have prevented, in some states right now they're trying to make the schools financially responsible for events that they couldn't even control. This helps you. It involves a community because we're keeping in our first responders, our mental health people, parents, advocates for the child, etc. So we can prevent this from happening, and we can stop it using our knowledge of the phases of an active shooter event or targeted act of violence. If we know how the process works, we can catch the kids while they're in the process. It's not a violent person. It's a person on the pathway to violence. Why is that person on the pathway to violence? If we look at some children and some adults who may be on the pathway to violence, we will see that their life is in crisis. And that's what's put them on that path. And so if we can change the things that have put them in crisis, we can take them off that pathway. One of the things that people never want to hear from me is the ultimate goal of a threat assessment in a K-12 environment or a college environment is not to permanently disengage the child from the school. If we disengage the child from the school, we can never keep track of the things that they are doing, and we can't help them. So this is what Marissa Randazzo and Jean Desmere came up with, the step, who is the subject? What are the vulnerabilities of the target? When we look at a target, let's look at a school. Are there places in your school, in your buildings, where violence is more likely to occur because it's away from the main crowds, there's not a lot of supervision, etc.? What's your environment or culture in your organization? Do students feel like they belong? Do students feel like they're engaged? Or is there a rift between factioning groups of students or students in the administrators and the staff? And what are any precipitating events that may trigger reactions? If you have a young, and typically male, a young male who is not feeling welcomed or accepted by his peers, especially females, and his parents are getting a divorce, these are precipitating events that may cause a reaction. Now, we can't keep the parents together, but it's possible that we can get the child counseling so that that's not a stressor or as large a stressor in their life. We can help them with coping mechanisms to get along better with their peers, etc. It's important that we use multiple sources. It's important that we have some skepticism. We don't want to take one single fact and say this child is going to be a school shooter when really we don't have enough information to adequately make that decision. We want to believe what's best for the child, but we also want to take a strong look at all of the facts and who's giving us the information. Back to, there's no accurate profile, and what we're looking at is behavior for a potential for harm, or does someone need assistance? Does this person need help? So, yeah, we want to stop the shooting from occurring, but at the same time, we want to get the person who's thinking about doing this act of violence, we want to give them help too. So we put people together so that we can gather the information, we can assess the information, and in the management referral, it allows us to have a process that we can work with this child. And if you've already listened to some of our previous presentations that are, again, available on the archive, or if you've heard me speak or read any of my writings, you'll know how important it is for your organization to be working with first responders, so that if you receive a journal entry and it's causing you concerns, but you really can't say, man, I don't know if this is something I should truly be worried about, and you have a good relationship with your first responders, your local law enforcement, they might not be able to answer you, but they could get you in touch with other people that could. I was working with the school district. We had some journal entries. I had some concerns because of my contacts with the FBI. I had a profiler that I knew. I had them check that out as well, and they confirmed our fears. So working with your first responders, huge, huge. Now, I've added this in recent presentations because people have said, well, Gary, what is it that I'm truly looking for? How can I be more quantitative when I'm writing my report or my summary about why we feel what we do? And these are referred to as the 4 Ds. And so you look at people who might have some of these situations at hand. And I'm going to switch over here if I can, just so I can highlight their point. You know, if we look here, a lot of children are emotionally troubled, but emotionally troubled doesn't mean that you're on a pathway to violence. But they've been doing some substance abuse and self-medication and taking drugs that they shouldn't have been. And all of a sudden, they're becoming hostile and aggressive to other people. And finally, we actually believe that they're going to cause injury to themselves or others. So using this here, we would say we have someone who's emotionally troubled. Our concerns are because they're using a lot of alcohol and other drugs. They were never really a passive person, but suddenly they're extremely violent and threatening. And we believe, based on some of their journal entries, they're going to harm themselves or others. It just helps us quantify why we are going to take the actions that we're going to take. So are they on the pathway? We look, it's not solely on the person who made the threat, but are there other indicators that could tell us that this person's on the pathway? And keep the victim in mind. Remember, one of the reasons why we're doing a threat assessment is because we want to protect the victims. And we'll talk a little bit later on about what we can tell the victim and their families and still be in compliance with FERPA. The sooner we get involved, the sooner that we can determine whether or not this is a serious threat that we have to worry about, or if it's just a child being a child, or if the child needs some help. So when we having this process from the beginning of the year, explaining this process to parents, training your staff, working with your first responders. The earlier we can catch this, the better it's going to be for the child, the safer it'll be for the schools. I talk about training teachers and other staff members, because if they don't know how they're supposed to report, if they don't know what to report, if they don't know where they're going to report, then some information is going to be lost. So when you create a threat assessment team, who can be on your team? Just about everybody. The one person I want to tell you to make sure you have on the team is you want to make sure that you have an advocate for that child. You know, if you've got a child that you believe is on a pathway to violence, they're a junior in the school, and you pull their transcripts, and you find out that in their sophomore and junior year they've taken the same teacher and they had B's with that teacher, but in all the other classes they had a D or an F, you're going to want to talk to that teacher, because obviously that teacher has some kind of a positive relationship with that child that may be used to shed light on why they are feeling the way that they're feeling. I put SROs, I'm going to pop back there real quick. In the state of Ohio and many other states now, what we're starting to see is, due to events that have happened in our country, if there's a true concern that a child may be on a pathway to violence and law enforcement is involved, They can actually go to the home, and we've seen cases where because there were firearms in the home that the child had access to, law enforcement was able to remove those firearms as part of a safety plan to reduce that threat. So this is what the Secret Service can. Okay, thank you. Jeremy has to tell me that, because I'm telling you folks, I could talk about this for about 8 hours, and I think I'm pretty fascinating, but I would probably bore you to tears. So let's take a look at what the Secret Service said. You know, it starts out with this concern for others, and that concern could be something you read, something you overheard, something the child said. Okay, so now I have a concern. So let's take a look. What is their intent? Is it specific? Have they started working towards the plan? Do they have the ability to carry out the plan? If you have a 4th grader who says in class one day, I'm going to blow up this school with a nuclear bomb, although it's doubtful that a child of that age could blow up anything other than a firecracker, the fact that it's absurd to say with the nuclear bomb, this child does not have the means, the capabilities to do those kind of things. Now, that doesn't mean we don't talk to the child about wanting to blow up the school, but that goes to what is some of the seriousness that's there. This threshold that is crossed, we sometimes see this with students who are planning a targeted act of violence at school. They might try to bring a knife to school, because if they bring a knife to school, it's easy to say, oh, I forgot that knife was in there, I had been whittling, or I had been cutting stuff, or whatever. But if they try to sneak a gun into school, you know what, that's not gonna fly when you just say, I forgot I had this gun there. So they might see what rules they can get away with, because that will help them in the planning phase if they decide to carry out the targeted act of violence. One of the most important things that we can have in this process are parents who are willing to be our partners in reducing the risk. So one of our clients who the student made some pretty specific threats. The student made a list, and then the parents were contacted. The parents were not supportive of the school's actions. And the parents said, this is just my child blowing off steam. This is just, you know, you guys picking on my child again. We don't think our child needs counseling. The heck with you guys. Okay, guess what? Threat assessment process ends at this time, because if we don't have the cooperation of the parents, we can't write a good safety plan that will protect our students and our staff from that child. Marissa came up with this flow chart. You know, we have a person of concern. We do a screening. Is it an imminent situation? Do we believe the child has weapons and can use them? Okay, we're going to contact law enforcement right away. We're going to err on the side of caution, because remember, we have board policy and plans in place. Conduct triage. Are there concerns? Nope. Close it out. Yes. Full inquiry. Make an assessment. Do they pose a threat? And as you can see, we monitor in these right here, close and document case. That's going to be one of the things that we'll use to protect us if something bad happens, because we can show we follow a process, we do the best we can, this isn't the only case we've ever done, etc. So documentation, documentation. It goes back to what I said at the beginning. If you decide you want to put a threat assessment team in, I know that LENSEC is going to give you a certificate when you complete the survey, but that's not going to make you qualified to do that. So let's look here at our different types of threats. And we see a transient threat that is not serious. We see a substantive threat, and this person here has put some thought into it, so it goes to serious and very serious. So transient, we're not too concerned about. Substantive, we start to worry. We still, every time we even if it's transient threat, we still act on it, but it may be acted on by just the principal and a teacher. It wouldn't necessarily involve the entire threat assessment team. So here we go. Let's do a quick quiz. A student says, I'm going to kill you. He said he has no plans to harm. He just lost his temper, so he's going to apologize. So here's our quiz. This isn't one of those polls. I'll give you all the time you need, 2 seconds. So if we decide what kind of threat this is going to be a transient threat. And it's unacceptable for anyone to say, I'm going to kill you, but when we interview and find out that's the way the child deals with their anger, okay, the first thing is, okay, we don't talk that way, and now let's teach you how to deal with their anger. So here we have 2 students arguing, one punches another. The student said he just lost his temper and he acted in self-defense. Now I'm going to tell you right off the bat, this is a trick question. This is typical guy behavior. Guys sometimes engage in horseplay. That horseplay leads to one person getting injured, and then the next thing you know, one child hits another child. So those of you that have just listened to that rambling, you will know that this is no threat. He didn't threaten him. It was a spontaneous act. Okay, so a student tells a friend he's going to beat someone up in the parking lot. That you interview them, the student is uncooperative and says, hey, what I do after school is my own business. So we know that there's definitely a threat, so A is wrong. But what makes this C a serious substantive threat is this person is now planning. This person is not, I'm going to beat somebody up, I'm going to get him after school, and I'm going to do it in the parking lot. And if I do it in the parking lot, the teachers, the administrators can't do anything about it because it's my business after school. So this makes it an easy one. You know, a student makes a list, scheduled to die. The child's not just getting attention. This is going to be a very serious substantive threat. I always put this akin to when I make a grocery list. I make a list because it's important. So if a student makes a list, that means they're putting some thought in. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that they're close to killing somebody. This can happen during the fantasy phase, that they can make this list. But this shows that the student is putting some thought into it. So when we look at what happens when you have a threat assessment, there are 2 pieces to the puzzle. And the first is the discipline, the consequence for the child making a threat, but then you also have the threat assessment. So they're not the exact same thing. The threat assessment, what we're trying to do is protect everyone, where your code of conduct is going to determine what happens to the student when they for making the threat. So if we look, this slide right here is one of the things that I think is very important of why we're doing the threat assessment, because what we're doing, these 3 things. We want to prevent the attack, we want to protect the intended victim, and for me, the most important thing is how do we help the student who is on that pathway to violence. Some people will say, well, here's how we're going to help them. We're going to expel them from school, and now we don't have to worry about it. Well, just because that child is no longer in your building does not mean that that child is no longer a threat. If you permanently remove that child from your building, you haven't solved any problem. Now, there are times when you have uncooperative parents that you cannot create a safety plan, that you're going to eventually have to permanently remove that child from your school to keep everybody else safe. I understand that. What I'm saying is your first goal should not be to get that child removed from ever. Your first goal is, how do I protect my students and staff? How do I prevent this from happening? And then how do I help that child who wants to do harm at school? Now, FERPA comes up in this because someone will say, well, so Johnny has threatened Billy and that he's going to beat him up after school, and really we can't do anything because they both walk. Are we allowed to tell Billy's parents that Johnny's threatening to hurt him? And the answer is yes, you can. And the reason for that is, Jeremy has promised to remind me to send you the FERPA guidelines on this. If you can articulate that there is immediate safety concern, and the immediate safety concern is my son is walking home by himself and a student has made a threat to harm my son, you're allowed to call me up, tell me my son might be at risk from this child because at this time it's an emergency situation. Now, if you decide that it's not a threat, you can't tell me that child's name a month later because it's no longer a threat. You can only advise that when you can only advise that when it's an immediate threat. So I will send you the FERPA information. Those of you that request information, I'll make sure you get it along with the copy of the slide. So here we go. So now we've had threats. And we've already said that this is a transient threat. So what kind of action are we going to take? We're going to refer the students to conflict mediation. There's no physical violence. We're going to talk to the parents, but we're not going to suspend a child for 5 days because we've already determined that it's not a substantive threat, it's a transient threat. Two students argue, one punches the other, so they lost his temper, it was self-defense. What are we going to do? Well, we know that the first answer is not correct. We have to do something. We're not letting kids hit other students. So we know now that the first one is out. So what we're going to do then, let's discipline. You know, there's going to be a consequence for hitting. We're going to interview the students. Do you still want to fight? And if we still want to fight, we're going to go to conflict mediation, or we're going to send them to conflict mediation regardless, because in our school we don't use violence. We don't hit people to solve our issues. So we've got a student that's threatening to beat up another student in the parking lot, and they are not going to listen to us because they think they're allowed to do whatever they want after school. So we've already said that if we notify the victim, that's not a FERPA violation. So we know that the first one is correct. So I'll give you a chance. There's one that we know we can't have done. We can't have ask the police officer to arrest the student because at this point here they don't have enough crime. I'd like to be able to refer the student to mental health assessment, but you might not be able to with the parents unless you can prove that this child remains a threat to the school, to the child, and because you've gone through the threat assessment process, you've said, okay, we're gonna remove this child, and they're gonna have to get threat assessment. So finally, here's the last one, the schedule to die. This is a serious substantive threat. We know that. I want you to look at those 4 answer choices, and there's only one choice that doesn't belong. One. And those of you that have heard me preach so far, you're going to know the answer is we're not going to expel the student. Our goal is not to permanently remove that child from school. That child may be suspended for 10 days pending an expulsion hearing, but really in those 10 days what we're going to do is we're going to come up with a safety plan so that we can protect the students who are at risk and get that child that's on the pathway to violence, get them moving towards getting help and off that pathway. So you have a duty to protect, which is going to resolve the issues, and it's going to help you manage your plans. Other things that we want to talk about is, you know, when I first started teaching, you know, we said snitches get stitches. And you know what, that's not the case anymore. We don't want kids tattling on each other. What we want is we want kids that if something is wrong, if they believe that harm may come to someone at school, let's talk to somebody about it. You know, we've got to tell kids that it's okay to talk about these kind of things, and sometimes when a student says, I'm thinking about killing myself, it's not a joke. By the same token, I think we should be able to say that in schools, just like airports, I travel all over the country, and you know, if I'm walking through the airport and I say out loud, gee, I hope nobody finds this bomb in my suitcase, I'm going to miss my flight, because there are just some things you don't say in some places. And I think we need to have that at school. It's, you know, if we go back to the student who had the Pop-Tart that he chewed into the shape of a gun, that child was being 7 years old. His behavior was understandable for a 7-year-old. The message we want to share with the child and their parents is that's just not the way we play at school. Make sure that your faculty members are on board, because they are going to be your first set of eyes and ears, especially in your art classes and your language arts classes, because of some of the writings and artwork that they do. I'm hoping that every organization out there listening has some kind of anonymous reporting. Most likely it's tied into your mass notification system or a way that people can say if there's an issue, how you're going to resolve that issue. As we kind of wrap this up, I want you to remember that this is recommended by both the U.S. Secret Service and the U.S. Department of Education. It is best practices. We are preventing things from happening, which is less costly, less dangerous than reacting to when something happens. We're going to protect the intended victim, and again, the most important thing, how do we get help for that troubled person? So, Jeremy, is this where you take over, or am I still on? Okay.
Pardon me.
This is where Jeremy
Steve?
comes in.
Okay, guys, if I'm correct in this, is where we're going to jump into just a few poll questions. Really curious to see how you guys respond to these based on our experience in this topic here. So, Keith, how are we doing this? Does it pop into the for each question, or are we just going through these?
No, I have each question. We'll launch each question independently.
Okay, so without further ado, the first question, as you see, is an active shooter event typically well-planned or spontaneous? I'll let you guys do just a quick click there. I'm only going to give it just a few seconds as we run through this, and we do want to answer questions. I know there's a number of them. Keith, how are we looking?
Still some people voting. Doing pretty well.
Okay.
Still have a few people voting.
Okay, so you see that died up. Let's head to the next one.
Some people actually don't participate, thinking there's a punishment for the wrong answer. Yes,
absolutely.
Well, and this one here is an easy one. 50-50.
We've leveled out here. Let me launch the results. We're looking pretty well here.
Very good.
5% well planned, and 15% said spontaneous.
Interesting. Columbine, that was almost a year in the making. That's how long that was planned out. All right, I think we're ready for number 2.
Yep, please. Important one here when we talked about the mental health assessment. So we'll go ahead and click on that, see how everyone comes back based on what Gary spoke towards earlier or in your experience.
I'll give you a hint on this that might help you eliminate one of the choices. Administrators develop a safety plan. So now you have a 50-50 chance.
All right, I've got my vote in. How are we looking, Keith?
Just wrapping up here. Let's see. Leveling out pretty well. There we go. Close the poll. There's the results for you. Looks like we're looking at 79% evaluate a person's risk for violence, 14% say evaluate a risk of targeted attack, and only 7% say administration develops a risk plan.
So those of you that said evaluate a risk of targeted attack, that's kind of correct, but what we're really trying to do is we're trying to find out what the person's intent is. Are they capable? Is this something they're planning on doing? Remember, just because somebody has sought mental health treatment in the past does not mean that they're on a pathway to targeted violence. Last question, the easiest one.
And just to speak to that last one, I think that's become much more to the forefront of the conversation, probably just in the last 12 to 18 months. I bet if we asked that 2 years ago, I bet that would be more like 50-50 between the first and second.
Right. Yeah, and mental health issues are probably some of this. It's a severe issue in our country, unfortunately. All right, so.
Well, we're wrapping
up
up
here. We're just
Gary,
just wrapping up.
Sorry, not to interject here while we wrap this up. I was going to mention, and as I've mentioned on past presentations, since we do have some concurrent themes like the training and training drills and exercises aspect of these things, or active shooter, that FEMA does have a great resource, online resource, in their Emergency Management Institute. If you want to answer the survey at the end of this and request any information on that, I'd be happy to send links. They do have a wealth of information, as well as some other sites that Gary and I can direct you to as well.
All right, Keith, last one. There we go. Bingo, right. The threat is not intent on harming another person. Okay? So, it seems like people were paying attention. Normally, this is better than when I was a science teacher and they slept on every day except the days of the explosions. So, Jeremy, we have some questions.
Yeah, I think so, Keith. I think you were compiling those. If you would go ahead and just jump.
One logistical question. Somebody asked if we were going to have copies of the presentation available. We'll be emailing that out to attendees upon completion of the webinar, so be looking for those in the next day or two. We'll also get answers to some of these questions as well. And you still have some time to get questions in if you haven't posted any questions. We still have a few moments here. But for our first question, let's see what we have here. John asks, is it true that threat assessment teams have been known to prevent targeted acts of school violence?
I would say almost every week a targeted act of violence is stopped in a school simply because a threat was made known to the school officials and they investigated the threat. And, you know, long before the Homeland Security's See Something, Say Something campaign, this is what we were recommending for schools based on the Secret Service Safe School Initiative. Every threat is evaluated to determine whether it's a substantive or very serious substantive threat that poses a risk to our students. So if you want to be able to look your parents in the eye and say, one of the ways that we are preventing violence from happening in our school is we have a threat assessment team to evaluate every threat to our school. In this threat assessment process, for those of you that attended the bomb threat protocols training, it's the same thing. Every time a bomb threat comes in, we assess that threat. Next question.
Okay, very good. Next question is, should law enforcement have direct access to school video systems?
The answer is they're not allowed to unless they can articulate a specific threat at a specific time. And I'll try to give you a quick answer because I know we don't have a lot of time. So I'm sitting in my office and I get a call from a local law enforcement agency and they say there was a fight in one of the high schools 2 weeks ago and we need a copy of the video because the parents filed charges. It happened 2 weeks ago. There's not a specific threat. So in that case, I said, I will make you a copy of the tape, but I need for you to get me a subpoena. So it was not an adversarial process. They gave me the subpoena. I gave them a copy of the tape. If I were to have just given them a copy of the tape, a public records request can't get a copy of that tape. The news media can't come to you and say, I want a copy of that fight tape, or a copy of the tape of that fight. They can't have that. The police, with the subpoena, can get it as a part of their investigation. So if after the investigation is over, the news media subpoenas the police or does a public records request or a Freedom of Information Act request to the police department, the police department can give them a copy of that tape. The school cannot be held liable because they were forced to give it over a subpoena. Now, if a child runs into the building in the morning and says to the principal, hey, call the police, I think somebody just kidnapped Johnny in the front of the building, and the police show up and they say, we need to see a copy of that videotape now. Okay, at this point here, a subpoena is not needed because it's an exigent circumstance, which means we can articulate the safety of that child overrides FERPA. So I know that I do a whole class on just this, but we got a couple more minutes, and I want to make sure that we get any other questions.
Okay. Sheila asks, we have a limited budget for safety and security. We want to spend our money on something that is sustainable. How are threat assessment teams sustainable?
Threat assessment teams are sustainable because you can train, you can do the initial training. And let's say that you trained five, let's pretend it's had 5 buildings. And in each building, we trained the administrators, counselors, and staff members. That training can last 5 to 10 years depending on the age of your staff. And if you lose 1 or 2 members in one building, you can get a staff member from another building to be part of that threat assessment team to evaluate the circumstances. So, you know, if you want to put a metal detector in your building, put a metal detector in your building, but if it breaks down, how are you going to pay for it? But if you train your staff, that training can be passed along, which is what makes it sustainable. Next question.
Very good. Have another one here. Why do we want to keep a student who's made a threat in school? Won't we be safer if we expel the student to keep them away from other children?
We're going to need to temporarily remove that child from the school for a couple of reasons. First of all, we have to create a safety plan. The number one thing is making sure that the students and staff are safe in the school. However, if we take a typical 16-year-old who we expel from school, that child is going to be home alone. Parents work. So now that child is going to be home, access to the internet, access to other things, and if that child is not getting the help that they need to take them off the pathway to violence, you've got a problem situation just waiting. But if we create a safety plan that says, look, we want you to come back to school, and remember, I'm going under the presumption here that we have cooperative parents. We want you to come back to school, but in order for you to come back to school, you're going to have to do these things here, and the parents have to agree to it as well. Then you know what? That's what's best for the child. That's what's best for the school. I know we have just a couple more minutes. I want to just tell you a couple things. Number one, if you haven't asked a question and you want to ask a question, continue to enter your questions, because even the questions that we've answered, as well as any questions that we haven't answered, I will answer those and you will get them. I also want to recommend, once again, that you go to the LENSEC website and look at some of our previous webinars on school safety. So any more, Keith, or are we going to, Jeremy, are we going to wrap it up because we're about at 2 hours, about an hour?
Yeah, I think we have time for one more. How does the threat assessment team fit into the 4 phases of emergency management?
They're going to be in the prevention and mitigation as well as the planning stage. So what we're going to do is we're going to put something in place so that we can prevent the attack from occurring. Because I don't know about you, but if we put this in terms of car crashes, do we want to prevent a car crash from happening, or do we want to deal with the crash after it occurs? Let's prevent the car crash from occurring in the first place. It's less traumatic emotionally, it's less traumatic physically, and it's better for our school and our community.
Okay. Keith, unless there's one other question we had to get in, I would.
No, we can go ahead and wrap it.
Okay. Just, really, again, want to express my gratitude for everyone spending the hour with us, and of course to Mr. Sigrist here. Gary, thank you. We always learn a good bit every time you join us, and really appreciate your providing us this information today.
You're welcome. I'm glad to be here. And again, LENSEC, thank you for presenting this, giving this opportunity, because, again, I know what it's like to be an administrator in school worried about safety and security and not having the funding to train or to get information to my staff.
And again, just before I let you go, know that if you would like to submit any ideas for a presentation in the future, please, by all means, we're open to all topics. Just next week we'll be doing an in-person presentation for ESC 11 here in Texas on emerging technology on the physical security side. So we have pretty good range on what we speak about here and bring in various subject matter experts like Gary. So please, by any feedback's appreciated. Thanks to everyone, and have a great afternoon and rest of your week.